good to be here. Thank you for having me. And as Sarah said earlier, we're having a big windstorm here, and it makes the ferry not run. So here I am back on my little island home. And who knows, if the power goes out, I might disappear. So we'll see what happens. I want to talk tonight rather personally. Often when I give a talk, I try and leave my personal views out of it and talk about the Dharma, but it feels like my personal views are just going to have to come in. And I know that my personal views will always be wrong to some degree or another. And so I want to apologize ahead of time if I speak views that aren't the truth. And you may have views that are clearer than mine. And I also want to speak as a citizen of the U.S. And I know that some of the folks here tonight aren't U.S. citizens, and some of the people who will listen to this later are not. But I'm speaking about what's going on in the U.S. because, for better or for worse, the U.S. is felt widely around the world. You know, I have the privilege of not having to know what's happening politically in Peru or Botswana. But for many people around the world, what happens politically in the U.S., they feel it. It affects them. So I'm speaking as someone who lives in the U.S., and I'm also speaking as a person. Well, for many of us, especially in the U.S., things might not have gone our way recently. The citizens of the United States have chosen for president a man who has been convicted of 34 felonies, who's been found civilly liable for sexual assault, who tried to overturn the last presidential election, a person who lies prolifically. And I feel like I could go on for hours naming reasons why I don't believe that this person should have been elected president. But a majority of the voters in the U.S. felt differently. And I imagine that some of those voters actually voted for him because of those things that I think disqualify him. And I don't list all those things just to say, well, my view is right. I do that to show how deeply divided we are right now. And this isn't just happening in the U.S. This is happening in other countries as well. Some of us look at Donald Trump and see someone who should be president, and some of us look at Donald Trump as someone who should be imprisoned. And this happens in other governments and in other countries as well. I wonder, how could this be? How could this be? And I think back over how things have been for others in history, and I realize, oh my gosh, this has been going on over and over and over again. In different times and places, people have been ruled by people like Nero, like Caligula, Attila the Hun, Pol Pot, Mussolini, Hitler. And there's a part of me that thought, oh my gosh, we should be better than this. We are better than this. But the reality of it is, no, we're not. We're just as much of a mess as every human has been and every human society has been. We're not exceptional. This is our time, and this is what's happening. The good news of all this is that because people have always been like this, it's not a new thing, our wisdom traditions have responded with tools that we can use to make sense of this and to meet our tendency to destroy ourselves from within. I was listening to a historian the other day who made an interesting claim. He said that no democracy has been overturned from an outside force. All of them have invited in the forces that overturned them. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me, because when we think about our Our suffering doesn't happen because of outside forces. Our suffering is invited in by us. Our suffering happens right here in us, not because of something out there. And Zen practice knows this, and so gives us some real tools that we can use here to look at how we might find our way through this and not let this kind of a time overwhelm us. And I want to look at two of those practices that Zen offers. And the two are the practice of equanimity and then the practices that we use to make sense of our grief. I'm going to talk about both of those tonight. And let's start with equanimity. As is often the case, when we want to understand something, sometimes it's helpful to look at its opposite first. So we kind of have a perspective. And I want to look at the opposite of equanimity first. And surprisingly, the opposite of equanimity is ignorance. So let me explain why that is. The Buddha taught that ignorance is the root of our suffering. And ignorance doesn't mean that we're not yet aware of the facts. It's okay. We have beginner's mind. We're often consciously not making opinions about the facts and thinking we know. But ignorance is a special kind of not knowing. Ignorance means that we are actively ignoring the truth. Actively ignoring it. And you can see that in the US in politics, we've been doing this quite a bit lately. You can look at the right side of the spectrum, the conservative side of the spectrum, and you can see clearly how that side of the spectrum has been ignoring the truth. For instance, that side has been ignoring facts about Trump that I iterated earlier, and instead embracing conspiracy theories that sort of excuse them. They've been ignoring the legal and moral shortcomings of Donald Trump. Also been mischaracterizing the role of immigrants in our culture and in our economy. Those are relatively easy for me to see because I'm not on that side of the political fence. But my side, the left, has also been doing this. We have been ignoring all of the people who feel left behind and left out in our culture. We have been overlooking the needs of rural people and working class people. And we have been actively creating a class system in which a few wealthy, powerful individuals get more than their share and leave everybody else struggling. That's coming from the left. So, quote, my side also is falling prey to ignorance. And we all continually fall prey to ignorance in one very important way. We ignore the truth of our oneness. We ignore the truth of our interbeing. And that is so fundamental to our ignorance because when we fail to see our interbeing, it causes us to see the world as a hostile place. And when we see the world as a hostile place, we're grasping after more of the things that we think are going to make us feel safe, and we're pushing away all the things that we think are going to make us feel vulnerable, even if that means pushing away the truth. And all of us have been doing this. Ignoring the truth can never lead us to happiness. That's really important. Ignoring the truth can never lead us to happiness. And why is that? Because if we do that, if we ignore the truth, we are building all of our beliefs and our activities on a fantasy. But in order to be happy, we have to build our beliefs and our lives and our actions on a foundation of reality, even if that reality is unpleasant. That's the opposite of equanimity. So let's go to equanimity now and talk about what might be more helpful. Equanimity, as opposed to ignorance, allows us to see, to embrace, and to respond to reality. See, embrace, and respond to reality. And equanimity is the antidote to the suffering that we cause ourselves with our ignorance. And it is this because it brings us back into contact with life as it is. And if we don't do that, if we don't practice equanimity and bring ourselves back into contact with life as it is, we are guaranteed to suffer. Guaranteed. So I want to define equanimity in a particular way. And it's a kind of balance. A balance. And this balance allows us to move through life's ups and downs without getting trapped in the extremes of either end. And one of the ways we see that this is happening, actually the opposite is happening, I've been reading that the people who post things online, most of the postings come from people with the most extreme views. So we all are kind of thinking that we all think this way, but really it's just a small group of people who've not practiced equanimity that have found themselves on the extreme, and they're trying to bring us to the extreme with them, no matter which side of the spectrum they're on. So equanimity helps us stay in balance. And there's actually three kinds of balance we want to talk about with equanimity. And I'm going to talk about each one in some detail. And these three are balanced seeing, balanced embracing, and balanced responding. And let's start with seeing. This is really an important one. As I've said, if our ignorance is based on ignoring the truth, then equanimity has to be based on seeing the truth. There's a common misunderstanding that's been playing out quite a bit lately that we'll be happiest if we surround ourselves with people and opinions that we already agree with. So we're turning on Fox News or MSNBC and listening to that and then thinking that we know the whole truth. But this is ignorance. This is moving to the extreme and basing ourselves on a fantasy rather than on reality. This equanimity of balanced seeing means that we see the whole truth, not the fantasy truth. The whole truth. And there's some things that we can do to help us with that. So this balanced seeing means that we listen to people that we don't agree with. Those people might be from other races, or other nations, or other religions, other classes, other locations. Whatever it is, it requires us to listen to people who are not like us. But this takes a lot of effort to do this. It's not easy. We tend to surround ourselves with people who are like us, who think like us, who act like us. And we have to make an effort to reach out to people who are different from us. And it's worth it because it brings us closer to the truth. We don't find the truth in our bubble. And the closer we are to the truth, the closer we are to the possibility of happiness. If we remember, ignorance causes us to have a fantasy view that is not conducive to generating happiness. But when we can expand our seeing in a more balanced way, we have a much greater possibility of grounding our views and our actions in the reality, and therefore happiness can be present. I got to really experiment with and learn this when I worked at hospice. In hospice, we have team meetings where we go over our patients from various perspectives. And often the medical people will talk about what's happening to that person medically, what's happening with their body. And after you listen to the nurse or the doctor, you might think, oh yeah, I really understand what's happening with this person. And then the social worker starts to talk about this person, talks about the situation that they live in and their psychological situation and the whole milieu that isn't medical, but more social and psychological. And then you think, oh yeah, now I know who this person is. And then the chaplain will talk about this person from the question of how they make meaning in the world. And now you've got several points of view that tell a story about this person, and you have much better balance in your seeing. All of us who gave those reports from our disciplines thought we knew about that person. But we realized, listening to each other, that we really didn't know. It took all of us looking together to be able to see that person more clearly. That was a really important lesson for me to learn. I can't get all the information alone. I need everyone else to help me. We need to do it together to have balanced seeing. Now, in order to have this kind of balanced seeing, it requires that we clear our listening space. Often we don't see clearly because our mind is biased. We want to justify what we already believe. So rather than accept the truth that challenges us, we'll just cling to our views and only see what we want to see in the world. And that means we don't have a clear listening space. So we have to actively clear away the obstructions in our listening space. And those obstructions can be beliefs that we hold, opinions that we hold, desires that we hold. They can be hatreds. They can be positive biases for people that we think are really great. All those things need to be cleared from the listening space for us to listen in a balanced way. That sounds like a big job, but actually we know how to practice this already. I do this actively by pausing and coming back to my breath. And a single breath taken in and out in mindfulness can clear my listening space. It clears away the clutter of all my views and my actions and the things I know I better do in the next 5 minutes. All that can go away when I take a single breath in and out in mindfulness. And it brings me back to this balanced seeing, at least the possibility of balanced seeing. And Zen is filled with these practices. We know how to do this already. Every time we do sitting meditation, we're clearing our listening space. When we do walking meditation, we're clearing our listening space. When we eat mindfully, like we do on retreats and in the monasteries, we're clearing our listening space. And you could argue that all or maybe most of Zen practices are primarily to clear our listening space, so that we can see in a balanced way. But here's the most important practice that I've found to bring myself back into the equanimity of balanced seeing. And it's a question that Thich Nhat Hanh used to ask us. Are you sure? Are you sure? Unbalanced seeing means that we are sure that we are right. We've already got the true opinion. We know what it is. Don't pollute my mind with your views. I know what the truth is. Are you sure? Balanced seeing must be humble seeing. The world is very complex. Like in those hospice meetings, we thought from our particular discipline that we knew what was true for that person. We didn't. We had to have the humility to say, I don't know until I hear from my other team members, and then I know more. But am I sure? No, I'm not sure. Balanced seeing is humble seeing. We usually don't have all the information. And even if we do have all the information, we've filtered it through our biases, through our not clear listening space. So we have changed the information as it comes in. We can't be sure. And when Thich Nhat Hanh would invite us to ask ourselves, am I sure? I would realize that there is always the possibility that I'm wrong. In fact, as I've practiced at trying to answer that question, am I sure? I have never once been able to say, yes, I am. Never once. It's one of the reasons why I opened this talk by saying, these are my opinions. I may well be wrong. I'm not sure. Okay, that's balanced seeing. Let's go to the next aspect of equanimity, which is balanced embracing. Now, once we see reality, equanimity asks us to embrace reality. And embracing reality really requires balance, because in addition to embracing what we like, we also embrace what we don't like. And the only way we can do that is if we are firmly balanced. Now, if you're a US voter and you voted for Donald Trump, embracing the election results is probably quite easy right now. But if you voted against Trump, embracing the election results is probably difficult. But either way, the practice of equanimity requires that we embrace the truth whether we like it or not. Not easy. Embracing reality doesn't mean that we like what's happening. But it does mean that we're willing to see that right now it's like this. Right now, this is the truth of what's happening, as best we can see it. Embracing this balanced embracing doesn't mean that we like what's happening now. We don't have to approve of what's happening or support what's happening or give into what's happening. But balanced embracing means we acknowledge the truth that right now it's like this. Otherwise, we will embrace a fantasy, and that does not give us the possibility of living a happy life. I had an experience with this one recently that was quite a powerful experience about balanced embracing. As some of you know, and I've talked about in the past, I have a neurological condition that gave me for a couple years a lot of difficulty in sleeping. And I got, for about 2 years, only between an hour and 2 hours of sleep a night. And it was very difficult for me. I would stand in the middle of the night in the dark, because this would happen a lot when I laid down, and I would be angry, and I would be frustrated, and I would not want it to be the way it is. And after some time, standing there next to my bed in the dark, not wanting it to be this way, wishing I could make this go away and thinking I'll be happy when it goes away, I realized I am not seeing this in a balanced way. I'm not embracing this in a balanced way. And I saw that it wasn't my symptoms that were making me suffer. It was how much I wanted these things to go away that made me suffer. And as I learned more and more to embrace the reality of what I was experiencing, my suffering decreased considerably. And now I've learned some breathing techniques that have really had an impact on my symptoms, and I'm not suffering the symptoms as much anymore. But that's not as important in my happiness as not fighting reality. So you may have these situations too that you might want to look at now, finding ways that you are not embracing the truth of right now, it's like this for yourself. And if you can experiment with that and see breakthroughs you may have that come when you begin to embrace even what you don't like. If we do those things, if we practice balanced seeing and balanced embracing, we now have the possibility of practicing balanced response. Now, typically, we don't do this. Typically, we see selectively by ignoring or becoming overconfident. And typically, we embrace selectively by just bringing in what we like and pushing away what we don't like. And then we naturally react unwisely, where we blame, we threaten, we manipulate, we try to control. And that's how we typically do it, because we're humans. But what I want to talk about tonight is that we can do it differently. If we practice equanimity, this will mean that we'll see in a balanced way by humbly broadening our point of view, and we'll embrace reality in a balanced way by embracing what we like and what we don't like. And we can respond in a balanced way, skillfully, in a way that makes things better for us all. And a balanced response is a humble response. Notice how much humility is coming up in association with equanimity. A balanced response is a humble response. We don't know that we have all the facts. We're always wrong to some degree. And we also know that humans have tendencies to tell stories about what we see, stories that make us into the hero and make others into villains. So our balanced response has to be a humble one. We do what we believe in this moment to be best, but we're willing to take in more information and try something else if this doesn't work. And back to my hospice experience with this is another thing that I learned about this sort of a balanced response and the humbleness that we have to have in a balanced response. The team would come together and discuss what was going on for a patient, and then we'd come away with what we thought was maybe clear seeing and embracing of the facts, and then we'd respond as best we knew how. We'd come up with a plan. But we'd still continue to see, continue to embrace the reality, and modify our responses. We would meet again and talk about what was happening for that person, and we never felt like we got to the one single truth. That here's the truth about that person, and so here's the thing you have to do. Every time we would try something, it was always provisional, because the person changes, the situation changes, we change, we may have been wrong in the facts we collected. We had to be very humble about our responses. But it doesn't mean we don't do anything. We do the best we can with what we know, and we stay open to revision. This equanimity does not mean we have to stand idly by while things are going on, but it does mean that we react with humility. We try a response to see if it works, and if it doesn't, we try something else. So we get out there and we try it out. But we don't think we've got all the answers, and if everyone would just do what we do, everything would be better. Okay. That's the first tool. I'm going to say fewer words about the second tool. That's all. I've already said a lot. I want to talk a little bit about our grief practices. And this is interesting that grief is associated with a way for us to hold equanimity. But in my experience, it is. Grief practices in Zen have arisen at times when life was very, very difficult. And in particular, in the 8th century in China, life was very, very difficult, just as Zen was getting its start. Tens of millions of people died due to famine and war. And so the practices that Zen created for dealing with our grief were very practical and very necessary. Now, luckily, we don't live in a time as difficult as 8th century China. But our time is difficult enough, and we can apply these tools. So here's what Zen teaches us about grief. The first and most important step with grieving, and a lot of us are grieving right now, is to feel what we feel. When things don't go our way, we have to actively feel our way through them. And we receive lots of messages from our culture that says, oh, buck up, put on a happy face. Or I love the British phrase of keep calm and carry on. Keep a stiff upper lip. And these are all really wonderful things to do, but not if we use them to cover up the truth. And the truth for many of us is that we're grieving. But we're also Buddhist practitioners, and so we have a tendency to want to look like good Buddhist practitioners. So what do? I'm fine. Everything's okay. I'm sitting quietly. I'm doing my walking meditation. But inside, we're suffering. That's called spiritual bypassing. And it's a road to suffering. So let's agree to feel what we feel. When we experience loss, grief arises. And many of us have experienced loss. We've experienced loss of what we thought the government should be, what we thought the people who rule us should be like, what we thought was the power of our own voice in our community. These are things that we've lost, and it hurts. Grief is a physical response to loss. It happens in animals other than humans. It's come to us from a long, long history of felt loss. And it's a physical thing. So let's be open to feeling it. When I've done counseling for people who are grieving, the things that we're trained to look for is if someone can flow with their grief. Now, today, it's strong and it hurts, it's acute, I can't get out of bed. And then in a couple of days, I'm okay, I'm all right now. And then later, it comes on again and it changes. We've been trained to recognize that that is healthy grieving, when we can be open to flowing along with its reality. What we've been trained to see as unhealthy grieving is when someone is stuck and can only grieve in one way. Maybe they're locked in their house for weeks on end, can't come out. Or maybe they can't admit that they feel anything to anyone. The only way through grief is to feel our grief. Now, how does Zen practice this? Well, we have some ceremonies when someone dies. We have a ceremony 7 days after they die, and the purpose of that ceremony is to actively open up our grieving. To say, yes, this is a loss. This beloved person has died, and it hurts. And so together as a community, we feel it. But there's more to us than that, and we don't want to get stuck there. So on the 49th day, we have another ceremony in which we close our grieving. We close that period where this animal part of us, this separate self-being part of us, is done with the active grieving, and we get more and more in touch with our true self, in which birth and death, illness and health, coming and going, are all just waves on the ocean. And if we can't touch back into that we are part of the whole ocean and the waves are okay as they come and go, we might get stuck in our grieving. So the wisdom of Zen is we open our grieving, but eventually we also close our grieving so that we can move on. So that's my recommendation that we do. We feel this, but that we don't get stuck here, that eventually we as a community come back together and say, now it's time for us to move forward with action, now that we've really felt our grief and we can feel the healing of that physical grief. All right, let's do a conclusion here and then open this up for discussion and maybe questions. Equanimity has to be rooted in a willingness to be with things as they are. Our tendencies to try to force the world to give us what we want, and not what we don't want, but this is not possible. And we suffer. And we have to look this imperfect world in the eye directly. We have to embrace the ugly and the beautiful. We have to face this world's greed and selfishness as at the same time that we embrace this world's compassion and kindness. We have to allow the world's faults and failures as well as its triumphs and its beauties. To do this is to have the possibility of happiness. To fail to do this is to suffer. Equanimity asks us to embrace it all. And when we do that, this world will break our heart. It will absolutely break our heart. But equanimity helps us restore our broken heart so that our heart can become fearless and compassionate and able to hold it all with love.